going to continue to monitor the waiting room because it looks like folks are still coming in. But I think, Catherine, if it's okay with you to get started.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, welcome everybody to the Digital Garden panel discussion with the artists, moderated by Catherine Amadei, who is our newest Praxis staff member, and she is the Digital Weaving Lab director, which is so exciting. And already we've been doing so much with her. She has been coming to Praxis from Ann Arbor, Michigan, to help us set up the TC2 loom. And this is our first program presented as the Digital Weaving Lab, which just launched last month. So thank you so much for coming, and hopefully this presentation serves as a way to immerse yourself in the show, because it's been, understandably harder to see the show, but then also a way to get familiar with the works. We have some really nice images, so it will feel like you're there and all the artists are there with you in person talking about their work. So without further ado, I'm just going to go through a couple housekeeping points, and then I will let Catherine and the artists take it away. So the exhibition statement and artist bios, image list, all that information is online in our catalog, which is on our website, and I will put that link in the chat. It was thoughtfully produced by Kaylee Salzano, who is an intern at Praxis. And actually this Friday, for anybody who is local to Cleveland, we're having a limited in-person closing reception from 6 to 8 p.m. in the gallery. So if you would like to see these works in person, you can come then. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Catherine one more time. Again, Catherine is our Digital Weaving Lab director, and she and Janice Lessman Moss, one of the artists in the show, have prepared some questions. And so the artists will go through kind of loosely round robining and talking through. If everybody who's here in attendance can just make sure to have your mics muted and your cameras turned off, that would be wonderful. And if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat and we will make sure to address them probably near the end of the presentation, and we will also have some Q&A. All right, thank you, and I'll let you take it away.
So welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this. I'm hoping this is going to be better than the kind of chat that we would have in the gallery. I don't think I ever get to think calmly about just the basics. And so I've prepared some questions and we sent them out so that at least we're not all surprised by this. And they're just basic questions to get us to have a discussion about the work we're doing. The exhibition, as you'll see in the slideshow, each artist is working from their own perspective. There's really evolved presentations and explorations and uses of material. And so all of those views, I think, would really, are really, to see the sunlight in this thing is really what the point of this discussion is. So I guess I'm just going to launch right into it because we don't have a huge amount of time, but the first thing I'd like to ask everyone is, how do you generate ideas and how do those works evolve? And so I guess we'll just raise your hand if you would like to answer, or I'll call on you if I have to.
I'll start.
Yeah.
I should start because I've probably been weaving on the TC 1 and 2 looms probably longer than anybody else in the room. And I love weaving, and I am a weaver from way back when, and I am very excited about pattern, and my ideas are generated A lot by the metaphors of weaving and the relationships of patterns to the micro and the macro cosmic environment. Everything is built on patterns. And I think about the little patterns of the weave structure, the basic kind of the smallest weave structure, which is a plain weave, you know, that intersection of warp and weft, and then growing from that warp and weft intersection and creating a little bit larger patterns, and then larger patterns, and then larger patterns. So it's pattern on top of pattern on top of pattern on top of pattern. And those kinds of things, of course, you can associate with lots of different content in the world. And I like that. So there's an underlying kind of poetic, poetics to pattern. We all look for patterns. Patterns are everywhere. They're in our bodies. You know, we've built from cells. They're in buildings. They're everywhere. And I like that kind of quality of construction. So I just start working with patterns and see how the works evolve from that. I do work from math. The mathematical aspect of weaving is really important to my work. So starting from, again, that small unit, growing to the next size unit, growing to the next size unit, working with templates, working with numbers, working with geometry is really how my content is generated. And I look for those kinds of poetic associations in those pattern generations.
I guess I'll pipe in since
Yes.
mine, I guess, would be related to Janice in a way that I'm also thinking about pattern, but the work in this show in particular is kind of dissecting a certain type of textile in a way, thinking about what I was thinking about, like a central motif or a mandala, something in the middle, and then the pattern and then the border. So like these three levels of what's presented in an image. And also sort of deconstructing what the TC2 loom can do in a way, right? Because it can present a photographic image. And so I'm really drawn to the idea that it can represent something that it isn't. So it's representing a photograph, but it's also built of these patterns of the structure that's holding everything together as a three-dimensional object. So in this piece in particular, you'll see that sort of loud mid-ground pattern or the fill pattern, which is a satin pattern, which is actually the thing that's being used to generate the image. And so I guess this work in a way is sort of meta and a little bit hard to look at because it's like fighting for attention on all these different levels. But I'm also really interested in, I'm glad, thank you for showing this slide, in materials. So in this image, I'm thinking about the ability for the Jacquard loom to hold the photographic image of something that I actually make. So in a sense, like I'm always playing physically and then photographing, like trying to generate my own imagery in a way, or found imagery sometimes, and translating it back to the loom. And then using a reflective material when I'm sort of trying to say that it's an image, for example, like this is based on a photograph, and then the matteness of the back is wool or a dense acrylic, so it's really drawing itself out as more of a textile. So playing between image and textile and the different ways that patterns play out in the macro and micro, much to what Janice was saying, are the inspirations between these two pieces in this show.
I think I could chime in with the meta element. I feel like the works that I have in the show, kind of in a similar but different, I think are kind of like a reflection back on the computer memory itself, and kind of this other level of kind of a simulated way that our brains perhaps you know, I guess are able to retain information. And yeah, so I'm working with imagery from, particularly with these two pieces that are in this show, I'm working with imagery of printable audio circuits and memory storage, ferrite memory core devices that are in early kind of 1970s computers. And so they kind of have a little bit more almost abstract designs in their format as like hardware pieces. And So I'm kind of starting at that as a inspiration point for shapes, and then altering some things in Photoshop, and kind of playing with those as kind of a springboard for the imagery, and kind of letting them be almost like this motif that is from kind of the culture, or the digital culture in a sense. So I feel like that's real. There we go. There's the dagger wing, which is named after this butterfly from South America, where I've also spent a lot of time researching textiles. So this kind of hardware piece that seemed to have these wings on it. And then I'm also using metallic colored threads that kind of simulate the metallic solder lines of hardware pieces, and kind of either in this case they're golden, or and then in the other piece they're actually iridescent, so they have like a kind of multicolor sheen depending on you walking around and the light situation. So yeah.
Okay, I'll jump in. This is Gabe. So my ideas are kind of generated just I grab bits and pieces of my life, as I'm going through things. And basically I'm just taking note of what's happening around me, what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling. And that sometimes is literal note, with words that I'm just scribbling down really fast, or, processing something later. And sometimes it's, photos or screenshots, of course, a lot this year. So just kind of, I think of like kind of constantly grabbing or gathering remnants or residue of whatever my life is moving through. And then at some point when I decide that it's time to make a piece, or I remember and start understanding and digesting what those thoughts meant, or what those experiences meant, I start thinking about that and want to make a piece, I'll start grabbing those together and start, kind of just bringing them together. And I don't know if we're talking about how the works evolve, but for me, I'm always looking for the tipping point of legibility and chaos. So sometimes that's literally legibility with words, whether that's through sound or text, but then obviously with the image as well. And even like the legibility or function or chaos of function itself. So the balance or the tipping point of chaos and functionality. And usually I'm trying to have things kind of feel like they've been exploded, fragmented, especially working with the image. So
Do I get to talk or no? I was thinking I should.
yeah, you should.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think about trajectories all the time. And so I really think about motion and movement. And so I'm thinking about the threads and the intersections, the interlacements, and their transitions from, here to there, from beginning to end, all the time. I've always really thought about this kind of culture contact aspect of experience. And so the latest drawings, all of my work has had this kind of motion, this sort of this instant, which I was recording with photographs for a long time, and now I've sort of switched to color. And so I've been using pastel and pushing colors into one another, mimicking really the same. It's actually linking, not mimicking, the beater pushing those those ends into place. And it isn't really an analysis as much as it's an analysis. So to sound confusing, but that's really what I've been really interested in. And so it's really about the dimensionality of the matrix that I'm building with all of those trajectories. And I really think about it as being just like real life a lot. And so that's where I'm at in that space right now with my work. So
I'm going to ask a question because it's interesting listening, and again, having had the privilege of seeing the exhibition. When you brought up, Gabe, your interest in kind of chaos and legibility, and I think about that quality of complexity, and many of the works in the exhibition, and are dealing with layers and complex kinds of relationships, which of course, as weavers, there is a, we've worked with the grid for so long, and now this opportunity to kind of expand on that and create more variations. And I was just kind of concerned, or I was interested in knowing other people's perspectives on that idea of complexity and how you work with the kind of layers and bringing things together to create a more dynamic kind of relationship of patterns and forms.
Here's where we wait till somebody goes, oh, that's me.
Well, Janice, you have the experience in this terrain. I mean, on some level, I feel like I'm still so new at really understanding. I mean, there's so much potential and so much that loom can do, and that these intersections can be, that you feel like I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, right? So I think, again, for me, it's the idea of the potential of the pattern, the structure, the binding, whatever you want to call it, to be both dimensional and very visual. And I've really focused on, I think one of the problems that I see in weaving is that because it's so complex, most people just kind of shut down because they don't quite understand what's happening within the intersections of the threads that they can't see. And so I've become really like overt in enlarging that and making it visible is one of my agendas in the work that I make. So the visual sort of glare or enlarged patterns, like kind of brash colors, is all part of my strategy to be like, look, I'm not going to be quiet. I'm going to show you, this thing that you might not be able to see otherwise. And so for me, that complexity, I certainly don't think I've dumbed it down, but I'm trying to expand it in a way so that it draws you in maybe more overtly.
Definitely. See that.
Not that these are colorful, but the other works are more.
Yeah, I feel like I've also felt similarly to you in the sense where I've had frustrations with maybe viewers not being able to fully see the what's happening. And I feel like maybe one of the strategies that I kind of started doing to highlight the hand element about this process is by leaving, because I use a lot of different textured materials as I'm weaving, and so I'm leaving the selvages wild so that a viewer could kind of really say, oh wow, there's different materials here that probably might have been hidden a little bit to a viewer who doesn't have a background in weaving or the process. So it's kind of, again, like making it very obvious that this is a hand process and not, there is a machine involved, but the hand is definitely present in every thread. And so I feel like that was a strategy that at least for these two pieces where I've done that also.
Yeah, I gotta say, if anybody, like, this slide is perfect right here too. It was so great to finally see these works in person, because they look gorgeous online, and that's the only time I've really ever seen them. So being able to be in this space, like Janice was saying, it's just been so great. So if anybody can get to the show, definitely do it. Or if you see that our work is somewhere in the future, like, it was so great to see this in person. But I totally agree with, that's what I'm drawn to. Anytime I work with the TC1 or TC2, I'm always really curious about the fact that it's the computer moving through us, right? It's not just the computer talking to a machine, it's total collaboration to me between me, this body of that I'm in, my machine, right? And the computer's machine. So yeah, the residue of the hand is like always there and potentially can be amplified. And I think that's where I started getting really interested in chaos with the TC1, TC2, is because it is so controlled. And, weaving really likes to be perfect and is really good at it. And so are machines and computers. So for me, it's interesting to think about how like a human involved in that process is like a grid of sand. It can really just kind of mess things up. It being me, the human that's weaving. And then of course you can do some really cool stuff with materials, right?
Yeah.
Which is what Robin was just showing.
Yeah.
Since we're on this, I'll just say like, this is definitely a little like slight nerdy meta, but it's really basic nerdy meta. I think this is Lakewise's piece that I did. And so this is definitely a math thing for me, where I was fusing like the classic coverlet systems that are based on 4s with a 10%, like a digital system of shrinking that 10% according to the depths of Lake Erie, which is what these rings are. So that's just like a little inside joke for weavers, I guess, but I don't think it's that complex, but obviously it's overshot. And I didn't ply together I did like 2 or 3 passes of wool on as weavers, we know it's complex, but it's not. It was a pain in the butt, but you figure it out and then you move on to the next thing.
I think about complexity. To me, it's sort of surprising that we can move through space at all. Every once in a while, I'll get a glimpse of just how much is happening all at once. And I realize how much of that I need to tune out just to exist. And so I think I carry that through into the weaving as well, that anytime, once you get to know something well enough, it doesn't feel anywhere near as complex as it did the first day that you tried it. Things kind of sort themselves out, and pretty soon you feel like you have, you've got a system moving and everything is ordered, and you can it's just movement that has a kind of harmony. And so complexity for me isn't really, I don't care about it that much. I really am just kind of it's like instead of pushing the thing, you sort of move with the thing, if that makes any sense at all. Where it feels complex is when I'm trying to object to something that's happening. Then it starts to really hurt, because you're working against the motion. So I think it's that I really feel the movement of those threads and the ends and all of the motion and everything. And I think that is what allows me to move forward at all. Just like driving a car on a road. I mean, in an instant, if you just take in too much, you can't drive at all. So let me move on to the next question. Did we all go through? Let's try another one. So do you work with any other creative art making processes, and how do they connect with your weaving? And what I think I want to do is actually put the other set of questions on here so that we can bop back and forth. And that is, what is the relationship with your work to that digital and the physical? And how does that inform your output? I think they can sort of be smashed together and come out with something good there. And once again, just when you feel it, just like a Quaker meeting. So do you use any other creative processes, and what is the relationship of your work with the digital and the physical?
I think, go ahead, Mary Ann.
I definitely work in other forms. And I think a lot of it is my need for, I'm really interested in exploring the three-dimensional. And so that's one aspect of how I have been trying to play lately is like, showing you these things, like what happened, I think a lot about people like Buckminster Fuller who build infrastructures, and in that sense, like thinking about the delineation between hard and soft, and like here's Buckminster Fuller building like a geodesic dome that's a skeleton and skin. So I'm going always back and forth between thinking about like the architectural and then the soft. So and how we fill those spaces or cover those spaces. And I think because he's the closest architect that I know who's like sort of playing with that tension and compression, I've been really drawn to thinking about the sort of math and nerdiness around platonic solids and stuff like that. But then also just being a materialist, you know, like as a weaver, you know, like I have these piles of yarn over here, or I have, you know, I have materials. I'm a maximalist. Like my studio is just a mess all the time because I just have stuff all over. And so then on the best studio days, I end up just playing with it. So whether it's, you know, making collages or sort of trying two materials together, you know, sometimes that's how, for me, you know, it's a good balance for me between all the time spent like digitally producing something to then get back and physically manipulate. And I think for me, that's a really important gesture. Like, I don't know if I will ever 100% generate the imagery that I use for the TC2 on only digital, right? Like there's usually a part of it that is in real life somehow. And I guess it's just because I didn't 100% grow up with Photoshop and Illustrator and all those tools. And so I always am playing back and forth between the real and the digital space. So, and that to me is how I balance my practice is balancing out the playful material-based stuff with the, okay, now let's scan it in or get it in somehow and think through how to represent that in a different way in weaving.
That's cool. Well, that's one of the advantages of teaching. I will just jump in and say that although my practice is really kind of at this point in my career, I am very digitally oriented, and I love the connection between the computer and the loom, and I really don't see much separation. I mean, I think when I'm sitting at my computer, that I really am sitting at my loom, and I'm designing things, and there is a sense of materiality that I project into the screen that I feel. So there's a kind of quality of tactility, even though it's virtual. I like that flexibility. Anyway, I feel very connected to the digital process, and yet, of course, the physical output is extremely important. The total evolution of your ideas, going from something that is a kind of imagined in digital space and then becomes real, concrete, as you're making it, as you're weaving it. There's probably nothing more thrilling or fulfilling than kind of moving through that quality of discovery as you're making. Even though you kind of know what you're going to make, it's still a surprise when you see it on the loom. And it's still a kind of a miracle. Like it's like taking a walk and you kind of view these things kind of evolving before your very eyes, kind of unfolding of this imagery that you've created. And I mentioned teaching because I do feel that I have such an opportunity to share in the creations of my students. And so, they kind of fulfill what you're saying, Mary, that kind of, you really want to still be involved, but you only have so many hours in the day. So it's like, okay, my students are doing this and somebody's doing this and somebody's doing that and somebody's doing that. And I'm saying, yeah, I love it, and go for it. And I can share in that excitement. And that's really gratifying to me, so that when I go home, I can, go into my studio and really kind of focus on, what's happening with my digital weaving.
But Janice, to also just mention, I think something that always strikes me about your work is your that like the counterbalance to the digital is the dyed warps, or the dye, all of this dyed material that you're bringing in, which again, like, unless you might not know, how that's entering that space. And so I think that uniqueness is what might be that hand element that isn't so obvious, for
Right.
sure,
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Marianne. And I do feel adding that element to the equation, working with dyeing, painting on the warp, and working with dyeing in the weft, and sometimes shifting the weft. And the pieces in this show don't have any shifted weft, but they have stripes in the weft, or different kinds of materials in the weft. So yeah, there's still a real strong connection to that physical engagement of the process. And that is, that completes the picture for me. If I don't, the digitization is really fabulous, but until you see that concrete object kind of evolve before your eyes and come to life and be its own thing, then, it's not done. So.
Yeah, I think I can totally relate to everything that you guys have shared in as far as the excitement of the making of the process, and how as planned as the trajectory starts, it never ends up the way that I imagined or the files began. And that's why I love it. that's the artist element. Otherwise it would just be a manufactured piece. And that's really the fun of the journey that I think a lot of people don't realize is happening when they, realize a computer is involved or there's this digital element, is that there's also this kind of with all these variables, there's improvisation with each decision. So each decision is going to totally change the trajectory of the piece that you're making, whether that decision happens in the file setup and the weave structure selections and changing, or the material selections, or the live process of color and material in the hand thrown shuttle. All of those steps have an opportunity to change the outcome of the physical. And that's, for me, that's kind of the exciting part. Sometimes, yeah, a lot of my color gradients are very improvised. I have like a colors selected of different materials and loose ideas of what I'm going to do, but I do let things kind of reveal themselves along the way too, because I've learned so often that the way I originally thought was going to look good actually doesn't. when you see it in structural form, it's not like putting colors next to each other with paint. It really changes when there's structural pattern and the kind of vibration that happens with a little kind of, I guess in a way they're like enlarged pixels. So yeah, just to kind of like echo some of those things. I also feel like for my work, two other elements have been engaging the digital and the physical, one of which is I've done a lot of video work kind of simultaneous to the woven work. And I actually almost feel like I came to the weaving process with more of a background in photography and digital photography and kind of a manipulation there and with video editing. And so I feel very comfortable in those worlds. And I feel like a lot of my sketching process is entirely on the computer now. And as I was first learning about weaving, I started making videos where I would utilize the screens of the video in the same way that I would make a weave draft. And it was kind of the way I was processing how a weave draft works. And but just thinking about, there's so many correlations between the grid and the structural system of weaving, and these pixels are actually called pixels in weaving, and these kind of building blocks that kind of create pattern structure within the grid, and how that translates to the screen and all the inner workings of the digital involving the screen. And so to me, it just seems like unexplored territory that's very clearly related and so exciting. But the thing is, I feel like both processes require like tedious amounts of labor, video editing as well. And so it's kind of like there's this that's unseen by the viewer, because the viewer just sees like the final 2-minute clip, and with everything that we're exposed to, we don't even realize the editing that goes into an animation or something. And I feel like similarly that happens in the woven work. There's this labor that's hidden in this meticulous process. So some of those things are the back and forth that I find myself kind of playing with. And then the other element for me is research. I've found it really liberating to pull myself out of my digital saturated world and process and actually learn and study techniques that are entirely hand driven in remote parts of the Amazon jungle or in the mountains in the Andes, and to kind of realize like, okay, this is what happens when you just have a few sticks and a tree and you have to make a complex structure out of, you know, alpaca wool or hand spun various materials that come from grass growing here, things like that. And not that necessarily those things, I feel like, I don't know if they're clearly a part of my work, but it still becomes something that I feel like is really important for me to kind of jump back and forth between, to kind of really make sure that I'm engaged in the hand and the physical process, at least in my way of researching what weaving is about, and how it's been historically a part of humanity's cultural expressions, and what I think that feels really somehow important to engage in a time when I feel like I'm you know, so saturated in a digital life that this kind of ancient touchdown feels like an important memory that needs to kind of be brought back into circulation. And what does that mean in a contemporary context? I think those are just interesting questions that kind of drive me creatively. So.
So we're talking about the other processes and the digital physical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, great. This piece, here we go. Like, so for me, I knew going into it that I wanted to think about like, I think the phrase that came to mind when I first talked to Connie on the phone was like something like physical pixel or spatial pixel or some three-dimensional pixel or something. And I think it's funny that, you know, that we're working in the digital sphere, all of us, but we actually do like a lot of bad practices or poor practices as far as digital media goes, right? Like the crunchy pixels that we build everything on is the exact opposite of what everybody else would be going for in any kind of, in any kind of graphic design, any real digital design world. We're kind of like in the opposite lane, which is interesting. But I knew like going into this that I would want to be doing something destructive at like or like fragmented. I know I'm saying destructive, but there's other words for it too, but and not just chaos, you know, but something dysfunctional. Dysfunctional is a really good word right now. Thinking about Legacy Russell's Glitch Feminism manifesto that just came out, which is a great reference. But dysfunction, right? So dysfunctional files, dysfunctional image, like that this is a screenshot of me. If I'm in a femme or feminine or female or whatever body, the way that being is being imaged is typically fragmented, objectified, you know, it's just like, how can that be dysfunctional in itself, the image itself? And then the file also becomes dysfunctional, where it has these parts that are not actually woven within the file, like it physically doesn't compute properly, right? And the machine and the computer reads the file accurately, and so it has input or no input. So feeding the machines and the computer the void, right? Built into the file itself. And then with this piece, this is the first time that, I mean, I did some other stuff like this before a long time ago, but when I was weaving it on the loom, I knew that I was also wanting to interfere with it and leave some more negative space. So I was doing dysfunction at the loom level, and then of course dysfunction post loom. So this one I decided I was going to laser cut, take the file and actually laser cut the digital weaving that I just hand wove. So definitely being destructive, definitely moving through those steps of like letting go and not being careful and precious with the work, right? And then the way that I moved it in space, I was definitely thinking about the grid and, you know, what is this? What if we could move through the file like that one, the credits in Matrix or something, right? What if the code becomes physical or spatial, really? So having it be perpendicular and parallel, but dysfunctional at all of those levels. Yeah.
So how, I guess we're sort of, well, I'm going to jump down to one of the other questions about the flexible plane. This is actually one of those tensions I experience myself, is that and I think we've mentioned this a couple times about this idea about potential, that you always feel like you're tapping, or that you're just standing at the entrance to something so vast, and you know, so much can happen, but I can really only do this much, right? And so that question actually, Janice, really appealed to me. But does the output as a flexible plane inform your presentation in a significant way? Does the physical tactile field play a role in the underlying concept? Here, I guess we're talking about presentation strategies, but doesn't really have to mean that. But I do think that a lot of times there is this idea about weaving as being a plane, just a physical plane. And how do we deal with that? I think that's the way that I interpreted that question. And I would just say that I'm always on the verge of making something that would be observed by someone else as three-dimensional, even though what I make, I fully understand to be three-dimensional and experience it the entire time, you know, the dimensionality of what I'm making. So that's sort of where I am on that scale, is that it's something I'm about to do, but I pull back from that for some reason, I don't know. But I wondered what you guys thought about that question, and if I need to repeat it, because I just kind of went overboard. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, because it intrigued me seeing the work. And of course, we don't have a couple of the artists here who are working with, putting their work on a horizontal, or Robert Martin's work where it's, really very much acknowledging kind of a sculptural presence. But even yours, Marianne, with, the stretched and the kind of physicality of your form, it has the kind of softness that, it's inherent to the surface, but then it also has this sense of rigidity. So, you were talking about that kind of hard and soft relationship, and that really kind of struck me, as an interesting kind of point of, consideration.
Well, I feel for those pieces, it was the first time that I framed and stretched them. And I think it was like twofold. I think one, again, they're very graphic. So it felt like the right thing to like put them in this context of this kind of rigid thing, and to frame them, for heaven's sakes. Like, it seemed a little bit over the top, but I liked that it's playing with object and image, right? And so it's becoming an object by being positioned more taut on a frame. But then the counterbalance, you can probably see a piece behind me that's sort of related to that piece, where it's not framed or mounted on a frame, and it is just a loose textile sort of hung on the wall, and there's part of it spilling out. So I definitely have not resolved to show my textiles in any one way, but I'm very interested in all the ways that all the artists of this show have presented it, and I think that's what's become really exciting, is is textile 2 or 3D? I mean, I don't know who, I don't know if anyone is going to come down one way or the other, but I think, I always say to my students, at least, like, one of the beautiful things is there's no one way to display textile. So you have to invent any way you want. And it's hard because I can't just tell you what to do, but I also think that's an opening to invent a new way. And so that's what seems exciting about this show is looking at all the different modes that the artists were able to employ. And I wish I could see it in person for that reason. But yeah, it's something that I'm always struggling with and trying to think about, and is definitely a focus of my the work I'm thinking about right now. So.
And Robin, you're actually, you're acknowledging a source that is very rigid and very mechanical, and yet you really are, presenting these very fluid kind of forms, and the tactility of the field is very apparent. And even, the scale, the scale comes into play there too, where you're taking something, you're inspired by a very small object, and then you're, expanding it, and wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like, the kind of pulling the reference out of its context a little bit is what kind of makes it more engaging for me. And I think it was you who were talking the macro and micro kind of push and pull, which is the kind of exciting part about weaving, is to see these structures, these tiny structures of alignment of threads form patterns. And then kind of the similar, it kind of struck me that this similar thing is happening within a lot of electronics, and it's really actually utilitarian. A lot of the way the lines of the solder and certain wires are set up, it's really just mathematical. What's the best way for the circuit to be aligned to achieve its purpose? It's really not an aesthetic choice necessarily, other than cleanly fitting on the hard chip that it's on or whatever. But kind of thinking about, I guess in a way, seeing that as this almost like ready-made reference that's interesting, with the way that lines are arranged and lined up. And for me, I've also struggled, or I don't know if I would say struggle, but played around with presentation. Because I've actually, there's certain weavings that to me really call to be stretched on it, and kind of in more objects or in a more painting dialogue, because of their abstract kind of linear references. And for me, often it's a certain size, like that feels the 16 by 20 classic, this is a painting, but it's woven, dialogue within an art history canon, that I'm like, okay, this work actually needs to be stretched on stretchers. But then if it doesn't have that dialogue for me, then it is really about this textile investigation between technology and the loom. And so in that sense, I'm like, this needs to be a flowing textile. And it really, that, especially the large ones, I feel like they, there's, when my display technique has been to kind of hang them on, I don't know if there's a photo, but off of a kind of a dowel, usually is several inches from the walls. So there is an objectness actually that comes, but the objectness becomes about it being the textile. And there's, even with, the fringe being left, and there's like all kinds of other textile kind of, I guess, connotations that the viewer will associate with fringe and where they've seen that before. And I'm really happy to include that in the dialogue with these like computer pieces, because to me that kind of really brings this like opposite dialogue of these two things that are the ideas that I'm playing with that seem opposite but actually have so much interrelated and so much in common, and even kind of built upon each other, and the invention of how the computer kind of even came to be. So all of that feels important, and I like the large scale being delicate also, with the way that it can kind of move with the wind of your body walking by, and kind of the delicateness of that within the context of a large piece. So yeah.
Sometimes these pauses can feel a bit awkward. I guess I'm going to jump down to the question about how your practice has evolved during our time of isolation. It's a long time, and I wonder if you have felt your weaving or your art practice. Do you feel that you've been impacted, and can you talk a little bit about that if that's been the case?
Reading Joyce Scott today, who said, she's like a kid in a candy store since she's been in isolation. Just what a treat it's been. We're surrounded by horror and chaos and tragedy. But as artists, that's generally the way we like to live, is in isolation. So this kind of opportunity to just really continue to focus on what you want to do is really kind of a gift in many regards, insofar as, again, I'm not kind of disavowing all of the horrible things that are going on, but kind of just thinking about how, I want to be in the studio, and I want to be focused on my work, and it really hasn't disrupted that at all. It's given me more opportunities because I haven't had any opportunity to do anything else. I will say, though, from a point of view of enhancement of the work, you'll notice even in this piece, this was one of the first pieces in my Dancing with the Distance series, and I started to reinsert these little metal I look at the points of light in my weaving. And I have done that before, but it seemed kind of more appropriate right now to have these little shiny spots, kind of marks of, just kind of hope and change, transformation. And so I've really been kind of working with that whole series. And I've continued to work with it now in some larger scale weavings as well. Both of the pieces, or all of the pieces that I have in the Praxis show, have the little metal inserts. And I really like that, kind of just a little reminder of that kind of sense of hope, that sense of future and space and whatever. But that's been something that I've kind of held on to since all of this started. And I don't know how long it will last, but I really have enjoyed working with it. And I have pieces on the loom right now that are still employing those little sparks.
I guess my situation is a little different in that I have two children. So, it's, it is what it is. It's more chaotic at home, right? So there isn't as much space. I would say I'd been thinking so much about weaving in relationship to the domestic because of where I teach, which is in the School of Human Ecology at UW-Madison. and so this program has been grounded for a long time in the domestic or home economics. And so that's been something sort of that's been sifting through my head in my duration as a faculty member here. But I think having to be at home over the past, how long has it been, 9-10 months now, has really seeped in even more, like, oh, I am a home weaver. I am, this is a domestic space that is my studio, whether I like it or not. And so, it's a juggle for me. I have a lot of different projects going on. I also run a small business selling handheld looms. And so that's been also this like, trying to keep that going because I want people to weave, but then also like trying to carve out some time to make my own work and to work on the computer and get the files ready. But then, my access to the loom is at school. And so, and you couldn't get on campus for the first 5 months of this. And so, I mean, I can't say it's been horrible for my making. Like there's been a lot of joys that I've found in certain moments, but I will say there is a new chaos involved in sort of how I move through the studio space, with now having to bridge between home and my school studio. So.
Yeah, I can relate to the challenges of this time, both being sometimes a beautiful opportunity to have more making time, more studio time, but then also feeling some of my inspiration kind of being clogged up by just the chaos of the times, and especially living here in New York City, which was kind of like in those first few months the epicenter. And I'm actually, an artist living in kind of maybe not the nicest part of New York City with a lot 2 blocks away from a hospital, and just ambulances up by my door window where I, my little inner sanctuary, just 24/7. And kind of the energy of that was, I felt very creatively blocked for a long time. Luckily I had already started the piece, Obsidian Butterfly, that's in the show. I had already started it. So I feel like a lot of the creative part had already been done as far as the file setups and things. And I had actually started weaving before everything happened. And so I was able to kind of come in and just kind of in that meditative weave time where there's still some, color decisions happening, but a lot of it was making it. It's such a large piece that it really was, the making. And then strangely for me, I've really used a lot of that, particularly that earlier part of this time, of the, whatever we call this pandemic, I don't even know, 2020, to explore some things that I had learned in my research travels to South America, and kind of something I had picked up about the relationship with music, and particularly rhythm, with some of the weaving in certain cultures involving like songs that would be sung while you're weaving. And so and I had made some recordings and kind of researched it, but I hadn't really spent the time with it. And so during this time I started playing the drum, which was like this incredibly therapeutic thing that is involved with patterns. And I felt like I can understand this. It's really just patterns and variations. And I was working, in fact, the piece that I was weaving is actually a printable audio circuit. So it felt like there's this, maybe this was a way to investigate something that I wouldn't have had the chance to do had I not been allotted some of this time, that I think is now maybe going to merge with my practice more. And in the future to think what can happen with an audio component to the work. So I don't know, that was kind of a strange diversion, but I feel like or at least in my journey as an artist, sometimes it's when you start picking up something that's totally unrelated that these beautiful, synergistic, exciting things happen. So yeah, it's kind of a deterrent, but something that I think has brought me joy too. Kind of the excitement of like learning dabbling in a new medium as well in that sense, but then kind of coming back to my studio with a new vigor of, oh, okay, now it's back to this thing that I know and I love, and how can I bring the energy of all this into material out playing again. But I'm actually, after I finished that piece, I had to put on a new warp. So as you guys know, with the TC2, that's just not the quickest, easiest process. So I feel like it's another stage.
I know for me, it was definitely hard, like as an introvert, like the isolation at first was really nice to have a break. But then, pretty quickly it's, you start questioning like, what's the long-term plan here for mental health? And it doesn't help that your access to community, just, friends and any kind of people that you would lean on, or just, to relax and clock out. And like, you can only access that also through screen time. So I feel very fortunate that I am able to be employed. But then also, of course, like having to clock in all the time through a screen is just doesn't work for somebody like me that well. And I'm sure a lot of other artists feel that way too. And I wanted it to not ruin my relationship to the computer too, you know what I mean? Because I do like creating through the computer, and I do like jamming out an application or something, or spreadsheet even. But a lot of that, it's like, how do you voluntarily sign up to do that after you've just done it all day? And it's just so exhausting. But anyway, so that's something that I was struggling with. And then I also knew that I just needed to be physical. I got really lucky to be able to do these 2 really large installations outside over the summer, like 200 to 300 feet each long, really big, kind of new steps in my practice, but kind of long time coming. So that was really good for me to get physical and, still be isolated, but not feel isolated, because I'm out of that space. It's not digital. I'm talking or being around other beings like nature, and just the sun. But then what was really neat is that I forgot about all of this, because I haven't woven on a TC1 or 2 in a long time, not really, like, not for a while, not in like a real way for a project. And so when I got on to do this one, I remembered, that it just, to me, it's always been so physical, because I've always woven at those looms specifically unseated, right? So standing, walking, moving, dancing a lot in between beats when you're working on the TC1, because there's all that time in between the shed raises. But, to me, that's always been like a direct link with something like EMDR. It's a physical thing that becomes a type of therapy, or just dancing, or the meditation of, if you're a runner, walking, there's a different level of brain activity that happens, through that movement, which to me has always been unique to the TC1, TC2s, even from other looms. So it was nice, like, to be able to clock in, as I would say, and just be on the TC2 for a second, and let a lot of the computer do a lot of the thinking for me. A lot of us that have done this, we know what that's like. And again, it's very different than when you're operating any kind of loom that you have to actually think about your treadling, right? So I don't know, I guess that's as far as how it's impacted my isolation. I definitely got the like creative block for sure too. It's kind of dried up, and Oh gosh, and it feels so futile right now, right? It's like to be an artist or make art, but then we also know that, I think like somebody else just said, we need it, we thrive on it. Yeah.
I think we were scheduled for an hour or so. And so I thought maybe now is a good time. We'll never end this conversation, and I hope we'll have many more. So just let's just see if anyone has any questions. I'm sort of looking at the chat now. Type them in the chat and we can go over that. We can spend some time, a few minutes on there, because I know there's no real way to really cover the situation, but there was one question I saw here about whether the transducer is a
Robert question.
Yeah, it's a piece with a transducer. Is it a sensor or an actuator? And what is this piece about? It's from Laurie Steger. Hi, Laurie.
Yeah, we need to have Robert answer that question. It's a good one.
Is that Robert or is it Robin?
No, it's for Robert.
I think it's
And
Robert.
Okay.
Piece.
Yeah, he's not here. I didn't hear that. Okay. So that's why I misunderstood that.
I can step in. I can't speak on behalf for Robert, but I believe the transducer is an actuator. And here, let me flip back to the piece. What's happening here, and it would actually be much better to have a video of it, but the metal tray has salt in it, and the transducer is attached to the left side. You see that round piece kind of sticking out. And the transducer is also hooked up to an amp, and the amp is hooked up to an iPad. The iPad is playing audio that's then being fed through the amp to the transducer and vibrating that metal tray that's installed. And then there are tiny holes in the front edge of that metal tray. So every time the piece vibrates, the salt is shaking down over the weaving, creating that, that pile of salt on the ground that accumulates slowly. And the weaving itself was woven and then encrusted with salt. And what it is referencing, it's the first of a series of 5 that the artist is working on. And they are all focused on and exploring and referencing the patterns that salt will make naturally when it's put on a vibrating plate.
Very cool. Right, so I don't see any other questions. Do we want to just remind everyone that the exhibition will end Friday? I'm more involved in like the digital lab space itself, you know. So this exhibition was this inaugural idea. My idea is to create gatherings around digital exercises. You know, I'm looking at the loom, but the loom is really just on the path between all of these other tools that we're using. And so I'm working hard on setting that residency up and hoping to create more gatherings in person, virtual, etc., and create a library of things, either objects or videos or books and all sorts of things at the house. We want to create a destination, a place that you can reference in your mind. If you need to know more, or you want to be near this kind of work, you know, go to Praxis. And so that's where I'm at right now, and looking so forward to the beginning of this experience, even though I feel like it's already begun.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And yeah, just to remind everybody, the show closes on Friday. We are having a limited capacity in-person closing reception from 6 to 8 p.m. So if you do want to see the work, feel free to come by. You don't need to make an appointment. And yes, thank you so much for.
Sorry to interrupt, but it looks like someone did have a question on the chat.
I
Oh,
have a
great.
question.
So I don't know if they want to unmute or type it. I'm not sure how you guys wanted to handle
What do we do?
that.
We
Sarah?
find them.
There she
Yeah.
is. She's gonna unmute. Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know the best way to do that. So I actually had a question for, and I'm so sorry, I don't know all the artists, so I just wrote down the last names of Kang.
Mhm.
So I was super interested in when you were talking about your how you came to weaving, which started with video and photography and digital sides of things and going into weaving, and I'm kind of fascinated because I'm sort of doing the opposite thing. But anyhow, I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about that or just comment on that. I find that very fascinating. I'm very curious about how you did come to weaving from a digital standpoint and how that might be different for some of us that tend to have the opposite trajectory.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it really just came from my background in studying art. My undergrad was in photographic arts, and it was, I guess, a time when Photoshop was kind of first made its way on the scene, and it was the thing, the program to kind of utilize and learn. And I mean, I guess it still is. um, and I really was fascinated with, even in kind of all my experimentation within the darkroom involved layers and kind of sandwiching things in negatives, and how kind of almost kind of a collaging techniques that were possible with the photographic image. And then um, the I think also I had a lot of fascination with the ability to go into the macro with the screen with Photoshop, and so I think some of those things really translated well into weaving. And I really feel like it was just being fortunate to attend a graduate program that was very interdisciplinary in its encouragement. And so I didn't really realize when I first went to graduate school, that I was going to kind of fall in love with weaving. I think I had already had a lot of appreciation for textiles, from just kind of exposure to handmade things growing up in South Texas and traveling a lot in South America. But it was the opportunity that I had at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to work with the TC1 and TC2 when they're, I guess, one of the first schools to offer that to their students. And for me, it was really, I was already exploring ideas of the pixel and the relationship to the screen, and kind of all of these the macro, all the things that are kind of breaking down with the screen. I was studying with some of the glitch artists that were kind of using data moshing or various hacking techniques to kind of scramble pixels on the screen. And so this weaving then became this amazing opportunity to explore how I could really break down the grid or construct the grid. And you have both of those opportunities within it. And then utilizing the TC1 or TC2 is really the ideal tool that for me to explore those things that I was interested in. So it kind of seemed like I was trying very hard to materialize my photo collages. They were still very two-dimensional, and then this tool really became the opportunity to fully dive into the three-dimensional while still kind of playing with some of those imagery and kind of macro micro kind of ideas that I was already investigating. So yeah, I think it's a two-way street. I think you could start with one and end up in the other, or vice versa. You know, there is a lot of amazing kind of correlations happening between the screen and the woven structures. So seems like you're finding interest in both of those. Makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. So often the order seems to be the other way around. So it's so interesting to hear it. I don't know, hear another way. So thank you.
Sure.
All right.
Okay, one last chance for any final questions or thoughts. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us tonight. Thank you to Catherine for moderating and for taking this dive with us here at Praxis into this world, and for helping to guide the way. Thank you to all the artists. Thank you, Janice, Robin, Marianne, Gabe. Who am I missing?
Pleasure. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah, and
thank
Lorenzo
you.
and Robert, who are not here tonight, but whose works are in the show. And thank you to everybody for your time tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and hope to see you at events or in the world somehow soon.
Great.
Bye.
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 Thank
Thank
you
you.
guys.